Okay, seeing as it's slightly after 3 p.m., we'll get the show on the road. Call the meeting to order, and then the second item of business is the Pledge of Allegiance, so if everyone would stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, item number 3 is public comment. I don't see any members of the public present. I also didn't receive any emails. Chair Robinson, did you?
No, I did not.
Okay, then we will move on from that. Item number 4, approval of the November 22nd, 2022 Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee meeting minutes. What is your pleasure?
So moved.
Moved by Supervisor Zhang. Do we have a second? Second by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? Seeing none, we'll proceed to vote. All those in favor of approval of the minutes, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
Aye.
Okay, motion carries. Item number 5, policy issues, discussion, and potential committee determination, none. Item number 6, operational functions required by statute, ordinance, or resolution. 6A, discussion and possible action by committee. 6A1, approval of November 2022 claims and question costs. Any discussion on that? Do we have a motion?
To approve.
We have a motion by Supervisor Gibbs and a second by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, we'll proceed to vote. All those in favor of approval of the claims and question costs, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed say no. Motion carries. Thank you. 6A2 is our committee work plan timeline. So included in the packet was a chart of our proposed priorities within the committee work plan. Supervisor Robinson, I kind of assume you wanted the discussion to go around maybe filling in those start end dates, have some timelines put in.
I think it would be helpful if the committee began to try to identify when they wanted to work on things and try to get a time frame, and if there are any that are critical to budget processes and other items. But some of them, the ARPA and other federal grants, we've got a timeline that's spelled out, and we've got some commitments. We'll be spending our next meeting next week talking about the grant applications. But then we've got a number of issues relative to sale and disposition of excess property, tax delinquency, and property process. We need a long-term facilities plan, which also tied into the West Side Master Plan. The tax increment financing, I know there's been discussion about creating a task force in this committee, and they'd like to try to get that going soon. The cultural competencies is an ongoing responsibility, but probably needs some focus on the part of the committee to identify priorities as well as a strategic plan. I think if we could get, I think some of them, if we could get the tax increment financing legislative recommendations, if we could start that in January and try to get a task force recommended, that would be timely, both in terms of trying to get, that would be dependent upon the state legislature. But I'd just be interested in other people's thoughts and administration's thoughts about sequencing and timing of different priorities or tasks that we've identified as part of the work plan.
Supervisor John?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So
I want to comment to the promote cultural competencies and cultural and county employment policies. And I know that the Diversity Affairs Commission, prior to its dissolvement, they were looking and working towards addressing a lot of the policies and making sure that it fits, especially the employee resources policies there. Is that something that we can? And I hate to talk about establishing additional task force, because I know we have enough as well too, but kind of review, having maybe just a small group of this, a smaller subcommittee of this group here, review those policies more in depth as well too, and continue the work that the Diversity Affairs Commission was working on. I don't foresee it being a problem starting in the spring, but just my thoughts, maybe even in March, etc., going towards the end of the year, but just kind of my thoughts and suggestions.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe this is a question for administration, but what is kind of the policy or process for having work groups within the committee?
I'll defer to Corp Counsel and your rules on what that might look like, but in terms of kind of the specific piece where I see an opportunity relative to promoting cultural competency and employment policies and design and delivery of county programs and services. My 2 cents on where I don't want us to jump forward and lose sight of one discussion that this committee has had. The class compensation study that was adopted was a very significant step. That said, and I think the members of this body had said it, that's not the end of where we need to do to make sure that we can still continue to retain and attract top talent. I know internally as staff, our Human Resources Director has talked about conducting an analysis, and she's done some of this already, but an analysis of things like other benefits that we have. We've talked a lot about health insurance, that's great, but there are a lot of other benefits that employees look at, and I'm sure all of you that whether you're in the workforce or no longer are, look at things like holidays. How many paid holidays does our organization have compared to other local governments? You look at our work hours within our various buildings. We've talked about, and I think I've informed this committee previously, there are a number of counties in the state of Wisconsin, and there are certainly far more counties in other states where they've looked at 4-day work weeks. I'm not saying to move to that, but those sort of analyses, your role under your rules, having that leadership role relative to the development of employee work policies and benefits. I think those are opportunities for you. Those tie right into cultural competence. I know the Diversity Affairs Commission, as Supervisor Zhang referenced, did go through with our staff. We went through in a painstaking fashion each of the various chapters of our employee policies and offered some insights on opportunities to further improve those. But I do think there is a real opportunity for this committee to start to look at paid leave benefits like the holidays. I do want to bring you that information and get some guidance from you, because I do think, quite honestly, like was the situation with our class compensation study, we are perhaps a little bit below average in terms of the number of paid holidays that we have as a general rule. I also think looking at employee work hours in terms of how many hours, perhaps half-day Fridays were open to the public. Those sort of things would be important for this committee based on your rules. Those are your responsibilities relative to the development, leadership and development relative to policies. But to your specific question about how do you create a task force or a work group, if you want to utilize that, I'll defer to Corp Counsel.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. We do have a rule on this. It's in your County Board Rules, Rule 14 discusses how to create a governance subgroup. And the formation process really calls for, if a standing committee looks to create a formally constituted subgroup like a task force or a work group, that request can be made by the subcommittee. It has to be approved at the board level. And the request has to include the name of the subgroup, what the task it will be tasked to accomplish, what its relationship is in the governance structure, who is responsible for appointing the membership, the number, term, and qualifications of the subgroup, the duties and responsibilities, and the term that the subgroup would be in operation. This is all for creating a formally constituted subgroup. So in certain situations, we have seen over the years informal work groups put together. The caution there, of course, is if you have a quorum of any committee, you're running afoul of open meetings law unless you post notice of the meeting of that subgroup. So it's really a question of how you want to constitute it. If you want to create a formal body, you need to make that request to be approved by the county board, and then it's created.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just wanted to follow up, and the reason why I was just bringing that suggestion up of establishing a working group, or a task force or some sort, is because I know that when we were going through that effort, as you were on the Diversity Affairs Commission, it was a lot of work as well, to going through each document and asking for clarification, etc. So it was just a lot of work, and I didn't know if this committee would actually want to go through all that. So I figured that having a smaller group reviewing and bringing back questions, suggestions, comments, etc., back to the full committee to review would be a lot more, would be a better approach. But I'm fine with either way. The second portion, I think, as well too, is that we would, in addition to all the items that Administrator Leonard mentioned, I would love to for us to also have a discussion on our hiring on our marketing practices in marketing our career opportunities to communities of color as well too, or even disadvantaged communities or underserved communities as well, to see what we're doing and see if we can replicate other efforts as well too in trying to get our opportunities out there, because we know that we're struggling to find workforce or employees as well. So just kind of my thoughts. I know I don't want to get too much into the details, but I just think those are some items that definitely would need to be looked at under that category specifically.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion?
Allison?
Yes.
Did you capture those discussions in writing, or is that something that would be available to us?
Are you referring to the comments about the employee personnel policies? Is that what you're referring to?
The work of the Diversity Affairs Commission,
Yes,
is that captured?
Yes, I have some notes on it. I would have to go and dig it up somewhere in one of my boxes, but I can get that as well to get that. I know that we didn't finish all of the policies, so we did start those discussions.
I think my main question, we have this prioritized list. Do we need to set aside one meeting each month in the coming year where we tackle one of these things? I guess I'm getting a little confused about how important is it to attach a date to each one of these things? Is it more important that we just, okay, here are the things. In January, this one's going to be on the agenda. In February, the next one's going to be on the agenda. So we do have time to have a detailed, more nuanced discussion about a topic instead of trying to discuss the work plan at large in one meeting. That's probably a question for Supervisor Robinson. How did you kind of foresee that going?
Well, I think if you look back at where the committee has been, that the intent was to have the second meeting of the month, sort of that educational meeting. But even then, to queue some of these up, it's going to take a lot of work to pull them up. So I think it would be helpful if we could prioritize which ones come in at what month, which ones do we want to exclusively deal with at the committee level, and do we want to, as Supervisor Zhang just suggested, rely on some work groups. I think that's critical, because some of these will take a considerable amount of investigation and background to bring them forward. But we could do that. The tax delinquent property process will have an update from the treasurer today, but there are some decisions that we need to make and potentially modify some of our policies because of recent changes in statutes. But we also need to deal with the backlog. And I think what we're trying to do is sort of get a flavor as to what's critical. Obviously, the sale and disposition of excess property is only important when we have excess property, which will be happening in the near future relative to the social services building. So we'll need to have a policy in place, but we've got a number of remnant parcels all over the county, and how do we want to deal with them? They're kind of contingent upon the development of a long-term facilities plan. So I think the thought was if we could begin to just prioritize them, and maybe what we start out is in December or in January we talk about the TIF task force. I know a number of people are interested in that. We could then talk about whether we want to go with a work group for the cultural competencies and employment policies, and try to get that done in the first quarter. But we'll have ongoing discussions with others. But I think the thought was we would dedicate that second meeting of the month to them. But again, we need to know when you might want to bring them up.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. I guess then, does anyone have any strong feelings about, actually just numbering these so that we could have a timeline for the coming year? I mean, personally, I guess sorry, go ahead.
Well, let me just for an arbitrary purposes of discussion, I would put the tax increment financing 1, the cultural competencies 2, ARPA 3, sale of the or tax delinquent properties 4, and the long-term facilities plan and policy and sale and disposition of property. I'd lump those together as 5. And ongoing is strategic plan, but that would just be ongoing.
Okay, does anyone have?
Supervisor Leahy?
Yes, go ahead.
And the one thing that I had in mind in terms of prioritization was with the potential sale of the social services building coming up. I think it would be important to have a policy for sale and of excess county property prior to that building being vacated. And I'm not sure if where we are, I think the plan was to have them moved out by the spring of next year, but I don't know where that lands right now. But I would like us to have some sort of policy in place prior to that, so we're not kind of building the airplane as we take off in terms of setting that policy. So that's my only that's what I'm seeing in all of this prioritization. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have some interest, I guess, in maybe a higher priority to the long-term planning and excess sales. Seeing as, we're kind of talking as the tax increment finance districting issue being a task force, I mean, that might be doable because that seems like something that would be removed from this committee, so to speak, and be more of an ongoing thing separately. Is there any other discussion about this issue? Did you have one?
Maybe what we'll do, I don't know that we need to take action today, Supervisor Leahy, but what we can do is we can package this. I'll work with the administration and we'll put together a timeline and a calendar for next year. My fear is if we don't do that, we sometimes get swamped by other issues and we won't be able to work on our own committee's activities. So I understand what Supervisor Hart's concerns are, and we can work with the administrator to get a time frame that would result in a policy in place at the appropriate time. So we can bring this back at next meeting.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, it seems like the general consensus is that there's not strong opinions about which one goes first. It seems like they're fairly equally important. So I think if the timeline you proposed with perhaps Supervisor's Hart recommendation thrown in there, that sounds fine to me.
Madam Chair?
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Excuse me. The one thing that I think, that we need to be cognizant of is that, in some cases, we do already have some semblance of a policy. What I mean by that is when we're selling tax deeded property, we have a process where that property is not going to be sold, at least the first offering is not going to be sold at below fair market value. So I think the other thing that we need to understand before we start to develop another policy is understand the policies that are currently driving or does drive potential disposition of existing property, including tax deed property.
Thank you, Supervisor Gibbs. Yes, I would agree. I guess I would hope that the first component to discussing all of these priorities would be looking over our current policies, current rules, before we reinvent the wheel. Corp Counsel is nodding very enthusiastically to that, so, okay. Okay, wonderful.
Especially, if I might
Yes.
add in, as it also relates to state statutes, so that we're not in violation there.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for those additions. Yeah, as long as everyone, it seems like we're in a consensus, we don't need to take formal action, and we can move on to the next agenda item. 6A3 is a review of the budget process. I believe Supervisor Robinson, you had some comments to start.
Well, I think what we were looking for is just input and comments relative to how the budget process works. I know that the administrator has spent some time looking at other counties and trying to get information on how they are approaching the budget. But I think what we found this year is that we had a large number of new county board members, some of who got involved early and some of them got involved late. And I think some of them were frustrated with the process. So are there opportunities for us to look at our schedule, involve more of the county board in those discussions, looking at Sheboygan County or St. Croix County or other county approach to have meetings early in the year to develop some of the budget assessments or assumptions and criteria that we would use to guide the development of the budget. And, personally, I'd like to see the Finance Committee or HR Finance Committee with more time to look at it. And so that would require potentially having it earlier obviously having it earlier in the fall and but also I'd also look for more input from the members. But for some of you, it's your first budget, and it just would be nice to know what you saw as opportunities for improvement, things that went well. And I know Administrator Leonard, you've done some work on the other counties. I don't know if you would like to share that at this time.
Sure, I can share a couple of sentiments, and I'm, as Chair Robinson referenced, I think it's healthy to take a moment after the budget and talk about, just like Chair Robinson referenced, what went well, what are some opportunities we have, and I certainly, some of the takeaways that I heard related to, as Chair Robinson referenced, timing and process. So trying to get the full county board involved earlier, as Chair Robinson said, I think it would be helpful for administration and other staff to really get some guiding principles from not only the HR Finance Committee, but really the county board as a whole. What are the driving budget priorities for the coming year? And I think we can start that process earlier. I did, as Chair Robinson referenced, reach out to a couple of counties. And I think that that's one thing that resonated with me. Certainly as well, the opportunity to take our budget from its current process and integrate some of the feedback we received about programs and services, understanding what programs and services that are offered by each of our various departments and what programs and services are mandated and what level those mandates are going to occur or need to occur. I think finding the right balance between the county board as a whole and then what conversations need to happen at the individual department levels. I think there are some opportunities to flesh that out in terms of process, because as was referenced at the, in the discussion, I did go to each of the standing committees to ask that question of, what programs or services do you want more of? Or do you want new programs or services that would be underneath the standing committees, or which programs conversely do you want less of, or do you want to terminate? And the feedback I got was that those questions weren't overly easy to answer without having that underlying understanding of what programs and services are offered and which are mandated, and how those kind of relationships can drive that conversation. So figuring out a calendar that tries to accomplish earlier in the year that framing of the upcoming year's budget in terms of what are the priorities. Is it going to be a priority for staff compensation? Is it also benefit driven with health insurance, or is it a status quo budget? Or does the county board have some large priorities in terms of program expansion, service expansion that it has, that really should drive how administration works with departments to put those budgets together? I think would be helpful to have earlier. And then the last piece of feedback that I received was really not a surprise at all. It's been a constant point of discussion since my time in administration, and that is that our budget document and a lot of the information that comes out of it through our Kayenta system, or the fact that we don't use our finance system to generate our budget, trying to find a better form for the delivery of that information. And a number of supervisors actually suggested a form more aligned with that is used by Brown County, which I had looked at. And I think we're going to evaluate early on in 2023 what our capabilities are with Workday in terms of the reports that can come out, and how those, my hope is that we can use a lot of the canned reports, the standard reports out of Workday in terms of how revenues and expenses are input, and drive those directly into our budget document. So I think those are the big areas: timing, process, county board involvement, and then ultimately the document that comes out. I think I heard a lot of good feedback from individual supervisors that the budget over the last couple of years has been has provided more background information, but there's still a lot of opportunity in terms of the programs, services that we deliver, and how those are funded, and how we communicate that through the budget. So I know that was a lot, Supervisor Robinson, but those were some of the notes that I have kind of taken down from my various interactions with supervisors since the budget.
Thank you. Supervisor Zhang?
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. One thing I also noticed from this past budget cycle or process, I noticed that supervisors attempted to go in there, make certain cuts, certain decreases or increases to budget line items, etc. And I'm not advocating for this in any way here, but I'm just kind of curious if there's a way that we can also get the departments to come in front of the, committees to kind of outline a little bit about their increases or what their priorities are as well. I know that that's additional more work, but just throwing that out, the idea out there, as I said here, I'm not advocating for it, but basically, I guess more information doesn't hurt as well too, so that way committee supervisors that are interested in actually doing these type of cuts here, they understand what they're actually cutting away from those departments. Because I know I had discussion with Chief Billup at the one point as well too, when there were proposals being made that where, although it's labeled as supplies items, it was actually made towards whether it's more additional vests or additional items as well too. So just having more information so that way we can make the necessary proposals as well. Just a thought. And once again, I'm not advocating for anything, just throwing that out there.
I would agree that that's kind of what sticks out to me after this process, is that I think as a committee and administration, we did a good job of getting ahead of the full board earlier to describe the process itself and the steps that were coming. But it seems apparent that the part of the process that people want to be more involved in is that new, or that really detailed line item stuff that happens, in the summertime or early spring with the department heads themselves. So if we can perhaps make that more transparent and easily accessible, that was kind of my biggest takeaway too from this process. Any other discussion? Oh, sorry. Supervisor Gibbs.
Thank you. I think one of the things that stood out to me was the disconnect and the clear or maybe lack of understanding of how and what the budget is built on. And what I mean by that, I think there was a disconnect between what is operations, what is capital, how is even some of the operations funded, in that every dollar is not equal. A dollar in, obviously, infrastructure is not a dollar of tax levy. It potentially is $3 total. So I think that has to be to the forefront, has to be the education that we provide to the full board, in that when you're developing the budget, first off, and what is the role of the committee? The role of the committee and their oversight of the departments that they have and the recommendations on their policies and programs is great to have. Again, the administrator went to each of the committees and asked them to, if they wanted something done differently. I don't think it was clearly understood that what he was asking is there differences in programming, because your role is to set policy as to develop those programs and then allocation of resources. It's not to get into the weeds. Again, I'm not discounting that the supervisors have the ability to go there, but it's not to go into the supply category. That's administration's job to ensure that supplies are appropriate for each budget for each department. So again, I think there was a lack of understanding, and I think that falls upon this committee to provide that education. Budgeting 101 for counties is different than budgeting 101 for home. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to provide to them.
Thank you. Supervisor Robinson?
I wanted to just add on to what Chair Gibbs had laid out. I think that there's a lot of questions about fund balances and where do they come from and what are the restrictions on them. So I think we probably have some obligation to talk about that. We have, I think, an obligation also to, like the general transportation aids. If you have a decrease in transportation aids and you cut it, what does that mean in the long term? And maybe what we need to do is develop an education timeline for the board to sort of lead up to developing those budget guidelines that the administrator was talking about. But we could use the parts of the audit report as the basis for that. But I think that there's a need for much more education. And I know that Supervisor Lemmer had a lot of excellent questions through the budget process. And I think that her understanding was there, but I think there's a lot more that she has and other supervisors have. So maybe what we should do is look at developing a tentative budget schedule, bring that back to the committee and have you look at it and then incorporate it into their educational components for the county board.
I think that would be a great idea.
We'll go Supervisor Lemmer and then Supervisor Hart.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate both Supervisor Gibbs or Chair Gibbs and Supervisor Robinson because I did have a lot of questions, and I still do. I'm just struggling to kind of tie all of the information together. We have this really great visual that was in the budget of revenue and expenses, and then we have our audit. And I'm just not seeing how they tie together because it looks like it's differently categorized. So I work really well with visuals. So Supervisor Robinson gave out a visual right before our budget voting session that was super helpful. I would recommend some sort of notepad, big, huge whiteboard with visuals, because the teacher in me needs that. And colors. Colors would be good too.
Thank you. Supervisor Hart?
Thank you. Yeah, kind of my comments echo everyone else's. I think the only thing I have to add is kind of the process as we had it this last year. I feel like it worked if you knew what you were doing. One of the examples that I'll use is the social services budget. I heard that probably 3 or 4 times because it started at the social services board, then went to health and human services, then the full board. And I think being more almost painfully overt is kind of the term I want to use to the rest of the board. And this comes in an educational component to say that, you know, if any particular supervisor wants to push any sort of policy or, you know, support a program, not support a program, that they are aware this is where these discussions start. So if you have this certain idea, go to social services board, go to health and human services, go to infrastructure committee, and just making sure that everybody's aware kind of the committee process, where that process can be played out. The other part of it is just greater communication between the county board and kind of high-level staff too. What I kind of found was that a lot of the amendments to the budget were made without consulting staff whatsoever. So they came to the full board, and at that point we were talking about, well, now how does this impact a certain department? And then the department was like, well, you know, I don't really know because no one's told me about this until yesterday. So as part of that education, making it clear to supervisors, if you have a certain proposal you want to bring forward, make sure you talk through Lance to any particular department about how any proposal would impact that department. And that also would help kind of facilitate that idea that not all dollars are the same within the budget. So thank you.
Thank you. Supervisor Zhang?
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. I guess another suggestion I would also have, and it seems there was some frustration, especially when supervisors were trying to submit their amendments, that they had to submit it by, I think it was a Wednesday, and then they had to debate it in front of the HR Finance Committee the next day, in a sense here, just giving them actually adequate time so that way they can actually have time to review that, and giving committee members the opportunity to have time to also do a little research as well too. On those amendments as well. So just my thoughts as well.
Any further discussion? Okay, I don't believe there's really anything formally for us to take action on with this. Just good to have a review before we get too far away from the process. If you think of anything else, have other comments, you know, want to discuss more, you can certainly send that to Chair Robinson or myself via email, and we can keep talking about these things as the term progresses. Okay, moving on, 6A4 is committee recommendations on updates to the strategic plan. I think we settled on a few changes at the last meeting. Supervisor Zhang was unable to attend, so if you had anything further to discuss with your proposed amendments or changes, I think we'd be open to talking about that further.
Yes, thank you. I was looking to add a strategy C to the strategy C to the objective 10.6, and I think that's where it makes sense to me specifically. But I'm open to suggestion. But the strategy would just basically say working with the Greater Wausau Prosperity Partners to ensure achievement and implementation of the Greater Wausau Prosperity Partnership Economic Development Strategic Plan. There are several strategies in there that I feel that aligns with what we're looking for specifically to help address the workforce challenges that we have in our community, and I feel that that falls within the purview of this committee. So just my thoughts, throwing that out there, but I'm open to discussions on that. Just to follow up, I wasn't sure. I recall seeing an email that Administrator Leonard sent out a copy of the Greater Wausau Prosperity Partners strategic plan as well out to everybody as well too. So I think everybody should have that on. And should have been able to review that as well already.
Thank you. And thank you, administration. We've got the objective up there for us to see visually. For Supervisor Lemmer? No, for all of us. Is there any discussion on this proposed amendment? I can't see the hands anymore.
Madam Chair?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so I appreciate there's definitely area in the Greater Wausau Prosperity's strategic plan that fits Marathon County's strategic plan, or should be part of our strategic plan, especially when you're centering around employment and retention and also recruitment. However, there's also areas in their strategic plan that is not part of Marathon County's responsibility. And in particular, I mean, and I don't have the one in front of me. However, after reviewing it, there were several items that one, I think, created a website. I don't know that. That's why I caution us on adopting a strategy that adopts another's complete strategic plan. I think there's areas in their strategic plan that are under our purview, but just adopting the Greater Wausau Prosperity's total strategic plan, I feel is overstepping, and in some cases we're taking on stuff in that plan and trying to make it part of ours that's not part of our responsibility. That would be my only concern.
We'll let Supervisor Robinson go ahead.
I guess I had a similar comment in that I don't think the general public knows what's in the Greater Wausau Prosperity Plan, nor does the county board necessarily know what's in there. So if there were specific provisions of that we wanted to highlight, I think that would be appropriate. It makes it very difficult for us to measure our success on those. Not that it is a bad plan or anything else, but I think that if we want to make sure that these are measurable and actionable and understood. So if we could pick out some components of the Greater Wausau Prosperity Plan and put those in ours, that might be a better approach.
And Supervisor Zhang.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. There are the rationale behind why I put it broad was I just wanted to be a little bit more, in a sense, broad. I'm not against us being specific. I would be supportive of being specific as well too, and specifically outlining the initiatives that are in here, such as Initiative 1.3, employer engagement as well too. But we can even get even more specific and go into the strategies and actions as well too, if that's what we're looking for. But that's why I started off broad, to make sure to have that discussions at least, so that way we can decide how detailed we want to be and how broad we want to be. But I have no objections with being specific, and I can provide those specific ones as well too. One of the ones I'm looking at specifically is the 1.22. That's one of the ones I'm looking at, and 1.22, and let me see here, Initiative 2.2 as well too. So, like I said here, I can definitely be more specific if needed be. Just throwing that out there.
Thank you, Supervisor.
If I might.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate Supervisor. I think we need to be specific, because if we're not specific, then it becomes challenging, as Supervisor Robinson mentions, at measurements as to what are the measurable goals. I know they have their goals, but again, if some of those do not apply, again, specifically one of the targets was to create a website, and if Marathon County is not going to create that website, then and we're measuring as how effective are we in reaching the goals of the Greater Wausau Prosperity Strategic Plan. I think we need to be specific as to what we're including in ours. So I would support this. I would support being more specific and having a discussion on each of the specifics.
Supervisor Robinson, did you have another comment?
I'm sorry, I didn't take my hand down.
That's okay. Was there anyone else? Any further discussion? Well, something that jumps out at me, I guess, since you did pinpoint some of the specific elements that you like from their plan, is that those strategies sound like something that would be greatly beneficial to discuss when we're talking about the committee's priority regarding cultural competencies and employee practices. Some that you highlighted specifically were about reaching out to the Hmong community, remote workers. Those sound like things that we've already discussed within this committee that we need to explore further. I'm not really opposed, or I'm fairly indifferent to the language of adding, our commitment to the Greater Wausau Prosperity Project's strategic plan to our strategic plan. But I think you did highlight some really great points that would probably maybe be more beneficial down the road in that further discussion. That being said, if we need to get into the weeds and discuss some of these specifics regarding our strategic plan more thoroughly, we can, but yes, we would need that language.
I just thank you, Madam Vice Chair. I just have a question about the process here. Would the committee be all right with if I bring back send those out to the clerk or the administrator so they can forward it out to everybody so everybody can see what we're looking at specifically, and then have a more thorough discussion on this point by point as well too. And maybe we can even invite the Greater Wausau Prosperity Partnership to come here and talk a little bit about those specific initiatives, what they're looking to doing as well too, so we have a better understanding as well. Because as I mentioned, there's several of them that I would be more than willing to. I think definitely fits with us, and I concur with Chairman Gibbs as well too. There are some in there that does not fit with us, but we could play a supporting role as well too with those. So, but I would be fine with us having that thorough discussion at the next meeting if we're all right with that as well too. But I'm open to just a question about the process.
And I think that would probably be thrown over to someone who knows something about the timeline for our strategic plan. I know we're kind of running into crunch time. We've been discussing this for some months now. Do we have time to bring this back? Supervisor Robinson?
Well, I'll ask the question for Kurt. Is this on the agenda for the executive committee next week, or will we be taking it up in January?
I have on the executive committee agenda next week 3 committees and their recommendations on the strat plan for discussion, and then 3 committees for discussion in January, in hopes that we've ironed out what we want as a strategic plan. And I don't believe, I guess I would have to ask Kim for her notes, if she has the notes in front of her as far as which committees we had decided on for exec next week.
Kurt, this is Lance. I don't believe Kim is on. We have, we're just logged in at her computer, but I can look to see, I can ask her when she returns to see what committees you had for each of those dates. I do believe Public Safety just yesterday met and took up their strategic plan goals and actually reviewed Health and Human Services as well. So I know those 2 committees have essentially kind of forwarded on their recommendations. Infrastructure has as well. ERC did at its last meeting. So you have, I think most of the committees have moved forward their plan goals.
So if I'm not mistaken, I think it was ERC, Public Safety, and Infrastructure were the 3 that are going to be discussed next week. So we can hold off on HR Finance to do that in January. So if we want to discuss the look at the recommendations that Supervisor Zhang has from the Greater Wausau Prosperity as far as implementation in the HR Finance, I have no problem with putting that off until or bringing that into January for the exec committee.
Yes, Lance?
And if I may, thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Perhaps just a suggestion, if supervisors are looking to make amendments to 10.6, I believe that is an objective that falls under the purview of Extension, Education, Economic Development. And I do believe they did make some recommended changes. They discussed at their last meeting, although I could not attend. So it might make sense, Supervisor Zhang, if you do have specifics that you'd like to have examined, not only by this committee, it might be a good strategy just to go through that process and take it to that committee as well.
All right, thank you everyone for the additional information. Supervisor Zhang, do you feel comfortable putting something together and bringing it back in January?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. If there's no further updates or discussion, we can move on. Did any other supervisor wish to speak on this topic? Oh, sorry, Supervisor Lemmer.
It's kind of impulsive, but maybe Supervisor Zhang, if you could look at 1.3.2 and 3.22, they address housing. I think housing is key to getting and attracting and retaining people. And again, I don't know how deep we need to go into this. I think the DC committee is going to be talking about housing and childcare in January, so it seems like it might fit in something they have on their docket anyway.
Thank you. All right, anything further on this topic? Okay, we'll move on. So on to discussion and possible action by HRFC to forward to County Board for consideration. We've got 6B1, 2022 intergovernmental budget transfers. There's some information in your packet about this agenda item. Does anyone have any discussion?
Madam Chair?
Yes, go on.
The only thing the one discussion I have is it looks like the budget, there's one that's duplicative, and it's the first last. It shows a $3,350 transfer for the Sheriff's Department.
Yeah, the reason being is that the first pages are the resolution that will go to county board because that is a brand new grant. So the resolution and then the next two pages, which are actually the transfer documentation. And then the rest of that was supposed to be the packet that just comes to finance. So I attached it again at the end. It should have not been in there twice because it's the same as the first one. The emergency government ones are in there. They're for you to move. It is not new money. That money was already in the grant. They just changed the fiscal year, so we just had to move it from the one sub-fund to the next sub-fund. So it's really goes to this department or this committee. Doesn't have to go. So that's why the first page is the resolution county board and the associated transfer. But then I do a packet for the finance committee, and that's all the transfers that you see. So that's why it's in there twice. So.
Supervisor Robinson, I believe I saw your hand.
Christie, I had a question relative to format. I noticed that we had particularly for emergency government, a different format. Is that based upon what we will be seeing in the future? Or is there a reason that was just more simply done by the staff there?
That would be on page 17. That's what it looks like when we do it in Kayenta. So they're actually, the reason that you're seeing that is because it's the same money. We just had to move it from one appropriation unit within the same department to the other. So that's really us making the notes on there so that we just moved it from one sub-fund to the other. That wouldn't be workday or anything else. It's just the background general ledger structure for us to make that work. And I just used that form because it explained everything you needed and also explained what I need to do if you had further questions.
Any further discussion or
With that
questions?
explanation, I'll do something I don't get to do very often. I'll move to approve the intergovernmental transfers.
Okay, what a thrill. We've got a motion from Supervisor Robinson. Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Zhang. Any further discussion? Okay. Seeing none, we'll proceed to vote. All those in favor of approving the 2022 intergovernmental budget transfers, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. Okay, motion carries. Thank you. 6B2 is an amendment of the 2022 Capital Improvement Program and Funding Plan to complete Phase A closure project at Marathon County Solid Waste. Again, there was a resolution in the packet. Is there any discussion on this matter?
If I can start,
Sure.
Madam Chair, I'll kick it over to Dave Hagenbusher from the Solid Waste Department to talk kind of from a high level about what the project, what's causing us to have the resolution before you that does a couple of things. But simply put, it amends the 2022 Capital Improvement Project Plan to create a new project, and Dave can talk you through why. And it also outlines what the funding plan, the proposed funding plan is for that project, and Dave can talk you through what the specifics are of that. In terms of process, it's already been discussed at the Solid Waste Management Board and at the Environmental Resources Committee. So Dave is on the traveling committee circuit, and he will be at the full county board in this month, because as he'll explain to you, this is a relatively timely, actually a very timely project that we need to move forward with. I have one other thing that I am going to talk about, and that's really just clarifying a little bit of math, which is, as Chair Robinson said, he got to do something that he doesn't get to do very often. Math is not necessarily my strongest suit. It's been a while since I've had to do too much of it, but just on page 22, the last page in your packet, we talk about this funding plan, and a portion of that funding plan, as Dave is going to explain, is from the contingency fund. And the plan, given that it is a contingency, the proposal is for that contingency fund monies to be spent, we thought it appropriate, in speaking with staff from Solid Waste, to make sure that there is a recapture of some interest. And my only correction is to the fact that when we talked about a proposed interest rate of 3%, the $292,852.76 is not 3% more than the component of the funding coming from the contingency fund as proposed. That amount that is proposed is $288,267. So it would just be to update that spreadsheet, that chart specifically, that far right column on the chart. It would change the, really the last two rows on that far right side. The ultimate amount repaid at a 3% interest rate, based on my math, is about $296,915. In terms of what that looks like for a final payment, instead of the $12,000 that's listed there, it would be $16,415. So still short of that $16,500 amount that's referenced during the repayment term. But that's just a very specific change that we can make. It doesn't really, the policy that Dave's going to outline in terms of what the project is about, what we're doing in terms of the work, and why the funding proposal is as it is laid out, doesn't really change. That's just a real quick update as to math. But with that, Madam Chair, if I can kick it over to Mr. Hagenbusher to talk through the work at the Solid Waste Department and what's leading to our request of you here today relative to the capital improvement plan.
Absolutely. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Administrator Leonard. So to continue disposal capacity for our community, we went ahead and constructed 6 acres of Subtitle D landfill liner, contiguous expansion with our active landfill out in Ringel. About midway through the year, the DNR approached us and said, you will not be approved to fill this landfill unless you close 10 acres. So it was sort of an odd approach, but it was the DNR's authority, and said that we wouldn't have the ability to continue filling unless we did this 10-acre closure. So we had not planned for this, and that's when we started working with Lance and Christie to better identify how we could complete the funding of this closure, which is about $1.5 million. So we've identified 3 funding sources. The first one is $657,000 out of the Environmental Repair Fund. So for those who might not know, The Environmental Repair Fund was essentially a surcharge on the tipping fee from 1993 to 1999. It allowed participating municipalities to utilize funds to offset costs associated with closures or cleanups that were EPA or DNR funded. So that was the criteria of this fund. Back in 2017, a task force was established to better identify if that specific dollar amount was able to be utilized for anything else. And based on the laws, it is not. It has to be used for a closure or a cleanup, thus meeting the need for this specific closure. The other $556,000 would actually be coming from our overfund of the pollution liability, which we have right now, which is fully funded. So we would just be bringing that down $556,000, so it's even with where it needs to be. The third portion, the $288,000 coming from the contingency fund, which is what Lance was referring to. To give you a little context and background, Chapter 289.41 of the DNR regulations requires us to have an owner financial responsibility. Essentially, if we disappear and the DNR has to come in and do a forced closure of the facility, they want some sort of funding guarantee. So the old model was always to put the money into an escrow account, which could be relatively unstable, and we could see unrealized losses. So it was per direction of the finance director to essentially go forward with a letter of credit rather than these escrow accounts. If we chose to invoke the letter of credit, the interest and the rates that we would pay would likely be much higher than if we're to just essentially borrow from Marathon County's contingency fund. So that was the context behind it. That's the overview of the project. It is nearly complete. It was a lot of clay work which needed to be done before freezing temperatures, and we are finalizing the project right now. So any questions, I am happy to answer.
If I can add one piece to that. So it's not in your packet, but I just want to, for transparency's sake, at the Environmental Resources Committee, Dave alluded to kind of the one of the three legs of this three-legged funding stool is that environmental repair fund. You may recall from the administrator's work plan that prior to this project coming up, there was a request by the county board to essentially have me work with the solid waste department and the solid waste management board to identify what are the opportunities to utilize those funds, as Dave alluded to. There is a memo in the packet from the Environmental Resources Committee that I asked Corporation Counsel to prepare, essentially corroborating what Dave just alluded to, and that is that this project, because it is DNR mandated, this closure, that it does fall within the strictures of the Environmental Repair Fund limitations that were originally put on those dollars by statute. So that memo is in the Environmental Resources Committee packet, but really for purposes of this committee, it's here not only just generally speaking, because it of course deals with budgets and funding in the capital improvement plan, but it does also relate to the use of contingency fund dollars. Again, I just want to make very clear, the reason we're adding that interest component, as Dave alluded to, the solid waste department historically, and it will continue based on our strategy here, if it's adopted by the board, will continue to operate as an enterprise fund. We're essentially serving as the bank for the solid waste department in a way similar to what the board just adopted through the budget process with North Central Healthcare. So don't mean to belabor that point, but I just wanted to make that very clear. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Supervisor Robinson?
Lance, I have a concern relative to the form of the resolution. Because we are dealing with a transfer from contingency, don't we have to deal with this as a interdepartmental transfer, and that will require a 2/3 vote, and the resolution doesn't necessarily do that. So do we need to put an additional paragraph in to clarify that we are transferring funds from contingency into a fund that will be treated as a loan?
I certainly agree with the logic underlying your point, and it will require a 2/3 majority vote. I I'll take a look at the resolution and I'll defer to Corp Counsel as to whether or not another paragraph is required, but certainly we can add additional information to the resolution to make it more clear.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. I think by operation of law, there's a requirement of a 2/3 majority vote. I don't know that the resolution has to say that, but if you want it to, it certainly can.
I think, are you comfortable that the now therefore be it further resolved that the Marathon County Contingency Fund shall be are we transferring this officially? I know we're committing it, but are we transferring it? Are you comfortable that the resolution would meet and, couldn't be challenged, or should we put additional language in just clarifying that part of this resolution is to transfer the funds to the solid waste from the contingency fund?
I'm personally comfortable with it, partially because I helped draft it. But no, I do think it does protect us from that potential challenge, especially ensuring that we have the 2/3 majority vote that's required. So I'm personally comfortable with it.
Supervisor Zhang?
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. I'm just going to ask this question because I can foresee it coming as well too. Obviously, we had concerns with the servicing the debt for North Central Healthcare as well too. Are we going to be insured? And I'm pretty sure we will be, but that we will be, that solid waste will be able to pay off in a sense, this loan that we're providing them in this case here.
Yeah, we set up the repayment schedule based on incoming tonnage, and we utilized essentially the low end of what we would receive. If anything, based on the $1.10 repayment, it would likely be within 12 months if we continued in that route. So, yeah, I don't foresee any concern on that end.
Thank you.
Okay, is there any further discussion?
Madam Chair, just one question.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. And probably this question is going to be targeted to you, Dave, and that is, obviously this was a timing issue, so it was unforeseen, and yet we're able to utilize $657,000 from the Environmental Repair Fund and also $288 from contingency. What was the original time frame thought to be that this closure would come up, and was solid waste going to be in a position financially to have all of that in reserve at the time when that portion was going to be? So I guess just looking at understanding the financials of it, I understand you have a letter of credit and you clearly could go borrow the money at any time. I get that. But the question becomes, would you have had, if it wasn't now, would it have been? If it was in some future date, were we going to have the reserves to cover it at that time?
Thank you. That's a great question. So we originally established closure for the Bluebird Ridge 10-acre Phase A location to be 2024. There was actually areas where we can see a significant amount of subsidence in the actual waste that's placed in there. So we're able to go back in and reharvest that additional airspace. Unfortunately, due to some of the calculations that the DNR was doing, they didn't agree with that approach, and they wanted to force that 10-acre closure because of the open footprint of the landfill. So it gets down to some specifics of engineering and design. In regard to officially funding in that 24 year, I think I'd like to defer to Christy on the owner financial responsibility and her recommendations to us in 2013 on how we best provide funding for these closures. Christy, would you have a minute to speak on behalf of this?
Well, Dave, the issue is that in general, the DNR manages a closure account for each of their cells and a long-term care account. And so the solid waste department works on with the DNR to develop the cost for each, the closure and the long-term care, and then a funding plan for that. They had fully funded A based on the engineering estimates, and closure was already done, and you have funding for long-term care. You have cell B, which, from what I understand, we anticipated would close before Bluebird Ridge would, because it's almost full. So it makes sense. At the time in 2013, we hadn't even had Bluebird Ridge open. So we were going to close that one because that one's at 99% of its capacity. So that long-term care and that closure in 2013, when we talked about it, would be the next ones that we would fund. And then the last one would be closure for Bluebird Ridge and long-term care, because that one just opened. So we've applied the funding for the cell A, then cell B, and we did not fund long-term care and closure for Bluebird Ridge. Now, to understand this, and Dave would know more from the DNR perspective, when you put those monies into those accounts, they aren't really managed by Marathon County. They are owned by the DNR. So in order for us to submit payment, we have to pay all the costs up front anyway. And then you apply to the DNR and ask them to please have our money that we have invested over here to cover the cost of the closure and long-term care. So with that in mind, even if we had fully fund, if we fully fund these, you would still be waiting for the DNR to approve those and then pay us back. So I think back in that day, this was not really on the table. We were going to go A, B, and Bluebird Ridge. So this is a little bit of a change. So this is how we've kind of met and came up with a way to try to get it figured out.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but with the escrow accounts that were established for A and B, specifically the one for Area B, there were unrealized losses in the hundreds of thousands. So if we would have pulled out because of that, the way that that's structured, we would have lost a significant amount because of the way it's.
Not back then, and we also have discussed that with the DNR, because the DNR regulates and tells us who can be the custodian and who can be the manager of those funds, and they required us to work with a particular company, of which we've sent several correspondents over the course of years. Now, the problem is that you'll see those even today on those, and we've not put the funds into that until we have more assurances from them. But we also hold most of those to maturity. Understand that the long-term care is over a 40-year period. We cannot invest over 7 years based state statute. So as we hold those to maturity, those mature at the book value. So even though there's a book value that is at the maturity value, the current fair market value can be under that. So again, we're not going to pull things out early. And because it's a long-term care account, they're in a lot of fixed income. So as you see interest rates go up, prices are going down on those. So again, you wouldn't want to pull those prior to maturity, because you could sustain an actual loss, not a market loss.
Just to follow up, so those are funds that are invested for A and B. So we haven't invested, if I'm understanding correctly, you haven't invested or funded for closure and all long-term care for Bluebird Ridge at this time.
That is correct.
Okay.
Any further questions? Oh, yes, of course, go ahead.
So on those, we do have, I'm just going in and looking at these here. You do have Bluebird Ridge Long-Term Care that we had funded. You have Cell A, Cell B, and,
For long-term care, but.
right, but not closure. So we do have a letter of credit with US Bank that we have to hold for the full amount of the cost of the full amount of closure. So we are holding that as well. So the problem also is when we talked to the DNR, is that because we're a governmental entity, you can't have something half done with the escrows. From my understanding, when we had our last conversation, I think Dave was at in 2018, 19, it was pre-COVID. So either they're fully funded or they're not. And if you half fund it, you still have to get a letter of credit to cover the cost of the full amount. So in that case, that's why at that time we funded A, B, Cell B, and the long-term care on that. So we do have a letter of credit that we have to hold and pay our bank to maintain so that we have resources available to do that. So this will at least allow us to pay for this, get this done quickly, and then we can talk to the bank about reducing the amount on the letter of credit and the DNR, which I don't think we've had a conversation on. We want to get this done first and then figure out where we stand as far as that goes. So these are a little more rules than most of our other investments.
Just one more question I have. Are there repercussions to not complying with this request for closure?
They would, they wouldn't approve the expansion, so we would basically be done with the disposal capacity and thus have to tell municipalities to find somewhere else to go with their waste.
Okay, thank you. Supervisor Gibbs?
Thank you. So this is more so looking forward then, and so we've opened, I don't know if it, an additional section in the Bluebird Ridge area as another cell. Is that correct?
It was a contiguous expansion, so it's connected on the bottom. It was part of the existing 15-year permitted site.
Okay. So the other question then that I have, are we going to then start to set aside funding out of required some, hopefully 10 years or whatever the time frame is for the remainder of that?
I apologize, you cut out a little bit, but I believe I know what you were referring to. Probably looking at future expansion 15, 20, 30 years down the road. We already have what's called phase 6 through 8. It's another 15-year permitted site life for another 30 acres, which is essentially, once again, a contiguous expansion, but a different permit. I believe this will still be considered Bluebird Ridge and not require an additional long-term care closure account. It would still be the same account. But I will have to double check and clarify that. Good question.
But I guess just to follow up on that though, Dave, are we going to start to pre-fund then the additional closure requirement funding that's going to be needed as we move forward on that on the next phase?
I would say that would probably be a discussion that the finance director and I and probably Administrator Leonard could discuss in detail and follow up.
Supervisor Robinson?
Well, I just want to follow up on Chair Gibbs' question. My concern is that we don't have enough money to do a closure at the time the closure is needed. And as I understand, we're going to borrow from the contingency fund and repay it with future user fees. But shouldn't we have enough? Shouldn't our goal be to ensure that we have money set aside at the time the closure occurs to cover those costs?
I believe this gets back to the point of the established owner financial responsibility. There are accounts that solid waste has that we could potentially draw from, such as our construction fund or our expansion fund, but if we decided to do that every time we needed to make a large purchase, we would quickly consume those funds. It's no different than doing a lease on a bulldozer or a front end loader. We could continue to grab the money that we have in reserves, pay for those items. But if we did that all the time, then that money would quickly be used up. So this was the established way of financing it, rather than grabbing from those other funds.
Well, let me rephrase that, because then you've got other dedicated funds for different purposes, but there should be a dedicated purpose for closure. And it seems like that fund is underfunded. And I would just ask that as we look ahead, that we make sure that we have adequate funds in the closure fund account to deal with subsequent closures. It sounds like this was accelerated because of the disagreement over airspace and other things, but at some point in time, we may go out of the landfill business, and I just want to make sure that we have enough money in our various accounts to cover long-term and closure costs.
And that's one thing that we're going to have to discuss, because at the time we made that change, there was some money both in the Bluebird Ridge long-term care and in closure. And from our last conversation with the DNR, it was all or none. Either you fully funded one, or you still had to get a letter of credit on top of what you couldn't put in cash. So at that time, we could fully fund the long-term care in Bluebird Ridge, and the money was put there. And we do have a letter of credit for that full amount of closure. So you are correct. We do need to make sure that we can fund the closure. But the reason that it was allocated to the A, the B, and then the long-term care on Bluebird Ridge at that time, not knowing that they're going to ask us to close Bluebird Ridge even before B, is because we were able to take that money and fully fund the long-term care account for Bluebird Ridge. Because as I understood it from that meeting with the DNR, if it doesn't have 100% funding, you still need to have a letter of credit on top of it. So we have only one letter of credit for that closure account right now. But it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't stop you from trying to fund the closure. We just need to, when we make that plan and we talk, we need to make sure we understand fully what the DNR's intentions are. If we put a plan together, are they still going to make us hold letters of credits on top of funding? Or, and actually, Dave, what's their next move? Do they want us to fully close B? Are they going to go after Bluebird Ridge again? So that's kind of a, we get a plan together, and it worked really great, and it got changed up a little bit. So we're just trying to get it done, and then we will meet with them again and make sure that we know which way they're going as far as closing the cells, and if we fund them, what their requirements are for future funding and financial responsibility.
Are there any further questions, or is there a motion? Does this need to be moved forward today?
Just in terms of process, it already has been approved by the Environmental Resources Committee, and I'll defer to Corp Counsel on your rules, but I don't believe one committee can trump another. In terms of process, why it's here again is, of course, that it does deal with financing stream that is your contingency fund, that it certainly makes sense for this committee to weigh in on. But I'll turn to Corp Counsel in terms of what, if anything, is needed here.
Sure. So because ERC did pass this and move it on to the full board, it will go to the full board. This committee can certainly also approve it, so that in front of the full board, it's clear that the two committees supported it. It does need to go to the full board this month because it is a 2022 capital improvement program project, and 2022 is almost over. So if we waited, we wouldn't be able to utilize the funding in the same way.
Thank you for that clarification. Supervisor Zhang.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. I'll go ahead and make a motion to approve the resolution as listed in the packet.
Thank you. Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, we'll proceed to vote. All those in favor of approving the amendment of the 2022 Capital Improvement Program and funding plan to complete Phase A closure project at Marathon County Solid Waste, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. Motion carries. Thank you. Our next item is 7, educational presentations and committee discussion. 7A, update on tax deed process. Okay, I see a hand raised. Go for it.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. So the treasurer couldn't be here today, so she asked if I could present an update on her behalf. So I have that update that she provided me with, and I'll just go through some of the high points and form of the update. And if there are questions along the way, we can certainly address those. From her point of view, over the past decade, the list of tax deed eligible properties has grown significantly to a level that makes them a little difficult to manage. At the end of 2021, it had reached 375 properties. And so that generated a series of meetings between the multiple departments that are involved in that process. And all 4 departments came together to identify a process that is currently the process. And as part of that, there was also the ability to contract out the title research part of the process. So it's essentially costs that the county incurs as part of the process. You can fold it into the tax deed so that you can recoup the costs through when the property moves. So then the county recovers those fees. We're allowed to do that under statute anyhow. So the property listing is also tied to this. The title research portion of the tax deed is conducted through the property listing area. And the last year, there's been some difficulty in keeping up with the number of properties in that particular area. At the same time, the county health department, who's doing the environmental assessments, said they can process 5 to 10 properties per month with the existing staffing that they have for this. And so from the factors that they identified, there was a goal of completing 40 to 50 properties in 2022. And since that original meeting, this is what's happened throughout the year. So in January and February, the Treasurer's Office had created a list of 50 properties for the title companies to research. And then that was bid out for Runkle Abstract and Title Company they won the bid to do that research for the properties. And through March and April, that research was completed and the title research fees were placed on all properties. And April through November, new legal notice template letters and publication templates had been created by Corporation Counsel. 6 of the properties had been sent tax deed legal notices. 4 properties have been published in a paper because the landowner was unable to be located for the property. The county health department was given a tax deed property list order so they can conduct the environmental transaction screen. And as of December 1st this year, 21 of the 50 properties have completed the environmental screening. The Treasurer's Office has also put the costs of the health department's work on the properties as a tax deed fee. So all those fees are rolling up onto each property. The 4 properties are eligible for the county to move forward and take as of December 1st. There's 3 properties of the 50 on the list with title research done. They paid off the property taxes and tax deed fees, so they got removed from the list. So some progress there. Although the timeline and calendar that I just went through quickly was below the goals that they had set for the year, there were a lot of mitigating factors involved. So some of the more noticeable ones that she mentions were the legislation that was passed that changed the process for counties in terms of how we have to navigate the tax deed process. So that required creating new legal notices and publications, and that took some work with Corporation Counsel to get those developed so that the county wouldn't face legal issues given the new legislation. Similarly, there was a full-time administrative coordinator who was split between real property tax deed position and point 1, I think, in Corporation Counsel. And over the time that position had been there, there was very high turnover rate with a total of 3 people in that position. And with the high turnover rate and the property listing backlog, the people in the position ended up being trained only on property listing to try to, climb that mountain. And didn't get to the tax deed portion before they had left the position for different opportunities. So she wanted to note that the position had originally been created with a goal of up to 50% of that job duties being assigned to the tax deed process. Another item is that the teller implementation, so moving to that as part of the Workday, et cetera, transformation for the county. The county treasurer's office has been assisting with the implementation of that and new point of sales. So that affected daily staffing duties, and so they were modified. That was a major factor for the tax deed project falling short of hitting the goals. And then, of course, Workday for the treasurer's office and everybody else. They've been assisting with the implementation of new financial software, and that changed the treasurer office workload as well. So more recently, the property listing was decided not to move the land assessment duties to CPZ office when the property lister and GIS specialist positions were moved in 2022. The decision was made due to the property listing backlog. So the focus was really on that area primarily in the last several months. Have shifting that to CPZ. And the land assessments are part of the listing duties under the real property lister statute, or state statute 70.09. So looking ahead from her perspective, the focus will be on the remaining 50 properties with the title research and health department environmental screens. And then with the implementation of Teller and Workday, she thinks that, and I would agree, that by the end of the first quarter, that'll free up a lot more time to place more focus on the tax deed process. Also, she notes here that the land assessments process moving to the property listing and CPZ office will allow more time for tax deed properties as well. So there's some open questions about the assessment piece involved in the tax deeds and the property listing. And just so you get a sense of the number of properties in a property listing challenge, is I reached out to Lori Miskimmons today to get an update, and so 95% of the documents that the county's received from January 1st through November 1st have been processed and listed. So that's a really big deal, because when it was moved over to them, there were several thousand properties or documents to work through. The remaining documents have some problems. They're just more difficult to work through, so they're working to resolve those by the year end. And currently, as of today, 30% of the documents we've received since November 1st have been processed. So essentially, when it went to CPZ, there was a backlog, and then since that move, additional documents have come on to roughly 5,000 documents to work through, and right now we're down to approximately 800. But that's largely driven by the fact that, there's 87,000 parcels in this county, and so every year there's going to be a large number of them, and it's tied to the document recording is tied to the tax bills and so on and so forth. So that's the core of her update. I do want to mention personally, I think that the prior comments by Chair Gibbs about looking at process and other comments to that nature certainly are germane to this as well, in terms of, with the new legislation change, wanting to look at our current process and ordinances to make sure that we're taking whatever steps we need to get in alignment with that, and then kind of reviewing how we do it now, so that if there's things that we can modify that might help generate some low-hanging fruit, for lack of a better way of putting it, we might be able to accelerate some properties moving through the process. I know that Administrator Leonard and Chair Robinson had also attended a Wisconsin surplus session at WCA convention. That's another avenue we might look at exploring. That agency works with a lot of different counties across the state, so it's nothing new to them, and I'm not sure what all they learned there, but my experience with them was very positive in terms of they come up, work directly with people to identify the properties that are easier to move through whatever the local process is, and then they really take a heavy hand in terms of moving those properties through the statutory requirements to get them listed at the assessed value, and then if they don't sell, working with this committee and whomever else within the process to identify what values you might want to list them at if you're going to put them at auction. So I think there's a number of different things we can work on. It's an area I'm roughly familiar with, so I've discussed this previously with the treasurer as well. And I've been looking at how other counties do it too, to kind of get a sense of that as I then shift to look at how we do things here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. I see Supervisor Robinson has his hand up.
Well, I guess I just wanted to convey my disappointment with the report and the update. We were trying to accelerate our dealing with that backlog of 374 delinquent properties because we buy the tax roll every year from the other units of government. And after the 10th year, we can no longer recover those costs. And I think we were looking for a way to try to accelerate our taking of the tax deed for those people that were that met the criteria for taking it. So I welcome an opportunity to look at process improvements. I would hope that we would not stop at the 50 we identified for calendar year 22 and just use that as a baseline for 2023, but rather expand that list and try to get it down as low as we can, because again, it's costing the county money. There are changes to the process that we need to roll into our process, but we also need to be more aggressive in trying to deal with this backlog.
Any further comments or discussion? Okay, well, thank you for the report. This is certainly something that will be added to our further discussions with our committee work and our priorities. If no one else has anything to say on this topic, we'll move along. Number 8 is next meeting time, location announcements. 8A, committee members are asked to bring items for future agendas. You can always email that to Chair Robinson or myself. 8B, next scheduled meeting, December 13th at 3 p.m. Everything is still a
And
go?
the December 27th meeting is canceled
Okay,
in honor of your birthday.
thank you.
Is it?
It's the best gift I've received yet. Okay. Are there any announcements, further comments? Okay, then we're at number 9. Anyone? Okay, we've got a motion to adjourn from Supervisor Zhang. Is there a second?
Okay.
Supervisor Lemmer. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. Okay, motion carries. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.